Hello and welcome to Newsmax TV. I'm John Bachman. Joining us right now from Austin is Texas Attorney General Greg Abbott. Mr. Abbott is also currently running for governor of Texas, but he's now focusing on a new challenge from the Department of Justice and U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder on voting ID laws in the Lone Star State. Mr. Abbott, it's good to talk to you again.
John, great to be back with you again also.
All right, so it's only been about a week or so since we last spoke, and we both kind of knew Eric Holder and the Justice Department would likely do something like this. I doubt the announcement that Holder would try to sue the state of Texas over voting ID laws came as a surprise to you.
Well, here's the deal. We've seen this coming because we know this is all politics by the Obama administration. As I mentioned before, Barack Obama's national field director came to Texas earlier this year trying to organize politically the state of Texas to help turn Texas blue. Now Barack Obama is sending his legal team to the state of Texas trying to prevent integrity at the ballot box. In particular, they're focusing on trying to prevent Texas from imposing a voter ID law. And let me just tell you the irony of this, and that is just a couple of days before Eric Holder announced that he was going to sue to try to prevent our voter ID law, the United States Department of Justice arrested a woman in Fort Worth, Texas, for illegally voting 5 times in the last election. So voter fraud exists in the state of Texas. Voter ID is one way to stop that voter fraud. It's stunning that the Obama administration will use political tactics to try to prevent us from having voter ID.
So are you saying this is not necessarily about race per se, this is more about the future of presidential elections in the Electoral College in the state of Texas?
I know for an absolute fact it doesn't have anything to do with race, because I know for a fact that voter ID laws are race neutral. And those aren't my words. Those are the words of the United States Supreme Court, has already upheld voter ID laws. What I also know, and that is that voter fraud is something that I have prosecuted across the state of Texas. It's real, it must be stopped, and voter ID is one way to stop it. But we also know that the Obama administration and the Democrat Party have been very open about the fact they are trying to grab Texas's 38 electoral college votes. And one way they can try to do that is to try to tilt the legal scales in the state of Texas in their favor.
Now, you said you've prosecuted people for voter fraud. How many cases in the state of Texas have there been?
Well, I can't tell you the total number because I'm not the only prosecutor of voter fraud. As I just mentioned, the United States Department of Justice sometimes prosecutes it. Local prosecutors sometimes prosecute it. In my office, in the State Attorney General's office, I prosecuted well over 50 cases. That we prosecuted people who voted or who cast votes for dead people, people who voted twice, people who registered foreign nationals to vote. We prosecuted cases where voter fraud occurred in very close election races. And so this is something that's very dangerously real, something that must be stopped. We're using every tool to try to stop voter fraud, and the Obama administration is trying to use every tool to prevent us from stopping voter fraud.
And it sounds like it's pretty widespread based on what you just told us. Now, let's also back up a quick second. Just a couple of days after the Supreme Court's decision this summer that invalidated one of the provisions of the Voting Rights Act, Texas made some changes to its voting laws. Tell us specifically what changed, just to provide some context here.
Well, one thing that changed is we updated our redistricting plan. One part of this lawsuit by the Obama administration, they're suing under the redistricting plan that we had in the year 2011. But we were in the middle of a special session and passed a new redistricting plan that basically adopted maps and redistricting plans that have been crafted by 3 federal judges. So the point here is that what we did in drawing our redistricting plan was perfectly legal because it just adopted what federal judges did, and you have to assume that federal judges didn't draw an illegal plan. But also proof of my point is the fact that Eric Holder is not suing against the current plan that we have in the state of Texas. He's trying to go back and sue under an old law that doesn't exist anymore, in fact, was never implemented. So it just shows the level of overreach they're engaging in just to try to force Texas under the ongoing supervision thumb of the Obama administration.
Now, it's kind of been portrayed the opposite way, that Texas was doing this to maybe kind of set up a challenge exactly like what's going to take place here. But you say it was the other way around. It was more the federal government coming in there, being proactive in a negative way and trying to force Texas's hand.
Yeah, and I mean, all this dovetails in a point that I've made before, and that is there's been a pattern of the Hispanic community in the state of Texas gravitating towards the Republican Party. The Democrats have been using this redistricting process to sever the unity between the Hispanic community and the Republican Party. And in fact, they used redistricting legal challenges to oust from office 5 Hispanic Republicans, and then they're the ones who come in and claim that we're being racially discriminatory. That's just not only absurd, but it's the exact opposite of what's going on here.
Now, last time we talked, we also talked about the fact that it was, you believe that it was a good there's a good probability that the issue of states' rights and in terms of voting rights would come before the Supreme Court again. Is this lawsuit by the DOJ the first step in that process?
Well, it actually will be maybe the second or third step in the process. The first step happened in our earlier lawsuits. The second step happened in that Supreme Court decision that came out in June. And let me emphasize one quick point from it, and that is in the United States Supreme Court decision in Shelby County, the U.S. Supreme Court was very clear. It said that the 10th Amendment gives the power to the states, not the federal government, to regulate elections in the states. And the Obama administration is directly violating that ruling from the United States Supreme Court, trying to say, well, they're the ones who have the power, not the states. And so this is a clear instance of the Obama administration violating the 10th Amendment. And
the other side will argue that the federal government still has this authority, but it's just not limited to the states based on historical records and the like. But that will, of course, be decided in this lawsuit and others to come, I'm sure. Do you think that Holder feels like he is above the Supreme Court, perhaps, by deciding to take this step to sue the state of Texas? He's maybe kind of indicated that in some of his comments.
Well, it's clear that they think not only that they are above the Supreme Court by these comments, but it's clear that Eric Holder is applying a double standard, because they're saying that by Texas using voter ID, we're somehow being racially discriminatory. Well, what about the National Democrat Convention, where they required IDs for their attendees to show up at that convention? Was that racially discriminatory? Is it racially discriminatory for Eric Holder to require IDs before people can go into his office, before people were able to attend the speech that he gave at the NAACP convention in Houston, Texas? Is it racially discriminatory for banks to require an ID for anyone to cash a check? Is it racially discriminatory for anyone to require an ID before they sell a beer to someone? And so there clearly is a double standard being applied here, and that shows why the double standard is being applied, and that's because this lawsuit is aimed at nothing more than politics. All those other things don't involve politics that have an outcome at the election polls. The voter ID in Texas does, despite the fact, and this must be emphasized, despite the fact the United States Supreme Court has already said that voter IDs are perfectly constitutional.
No matter what the motivation is here, there's obviously a lot at stake. And as we kind of look back this week at the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech and the March on Washington led by King, a lot of people are talking about King's legacy. And we just recently heard from Martin Luther King III, the son of the great Martin Luther King Jr. and Al Sharpton say the Voting Rights Act was essentially gutted by the Supreme Court in this decision. When you hear them say things like that, what goes through your mind?
It just shows how ridiculous their comments are. What they need to do, everyone should pull out the Shelby County decision by the United States Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court directly contradicted Al Sharpton and the comments that are being made, because what the Supreme Court made clear, and that is that over the past 50 years since the Voting Rights Act had been in place, it has completely altered the landscape for minorities participating in elections. Now, especially in southern states, minorities are participating at the same level as non-minorities in the election process. Now, after those 50 years, we see so many racial minorities holding office. In the state of Texas, for example, at least a third of the seats that are held by racial minorities. And of course, we now have an African-American president. So the dream that Martin Luther King talked about has been achieved, and what we need to do now is to move beyond race and start focusing on the real issues that impact lives of Americans on a daily basis.
Well, we've learned this summer that race clearly plays into a lot of things, even though a lot of folks would like to move beyond race, of course. Lastly, Mr. Attorney General, I wanted to ask you something that relates to both Texas and Obamacare on a separate topic. This week, it was reported that Governor Perry and Texas public health officials are in discussions with the White House to receive as much as $100 million of federal funding to care for the disabled in the Lone Star State. This program is part of Obamacare. Perry has been one of the loudest critics of the president's health care legislation, but by opening the door to possibly accepting these funds, is he sending a mixed message to the people of Texas about Obamacare?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't know the details about that. What I do understand, and that is the state of Texas wants to do all it can to help those who are disabled, those who are seeking a greater level of independence. And again, I simply don't know the details about the extent to which this may or may not be tied to Obamacare. Basically, what I've heard is this is a program that predated the Obamacare plan and is kind of a separate entity unto itself. But frankly, I'm talking about things that I haven't had the opportunity to look into and research myself. And so I wish I could give you more details, but I just don't have them.
Yeah, I know you got a lot on your plate, and we do appreciate your comments on that. And perhaps this is an example of something that may have been better if it was broken out into a separate piece of legislation, which we often hear Republicans calling for, and some of these big omnibus bills aren't necessarily the best way to accomplish these things like immigration reform and health care.
Yeah, incredibly important point right there, and that is, listen, when you try to cobble together Obamacare in a piece of legislation of more than 2,000 pages, it's fraught with problems, and what they need to do, and what the Republicans have insisted on all along, is of course we need to improve access to health care in this country, and the better way to go about it was to do it in different slices that would provide for needs like for those with disabilities, as opposed to going out and imposing this mandate on all Americans to buy health care insurance against their will.
Yeah, and you got to think somewhere in those 2,000 pages there's something good in there. At least we'll give the benefit of the doubt to the members of Congress on that. Texas Attorney General Greg Abbott, thanks so much for being with us. Always a pleasure to speak with you, sir.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for watching Newsmax TV.